Brian Hooker spent 8 to 10 hours drifting 4 miles of open water before he called for help. He did not call the Coast Guard. He did not radio another boat. He did not do anything that a man desperately trying to save his missing wife would do in those conditions, in those waters, in that darkness. He arrived at the boatyard at 4 in the morning, and he waited. That is where this story starts. Not with the bar, not with the drinks, not with the photograph, with the silence of a man in a dinghy doing nothing for 8 to 10 hours while his wife was somewhere in the water behind him. This is the crime files. No sensationalism, no exploitation, just evidence, just analysis, just the relentless, uncompromising pursuit of truth. Before we go through the timeline, before we walk through the witnesses and the photographs and the surveillance footage and the forensic analysis currently underway, you need to understand something about Brian Hooker that his defenders always mention first. Because it matters. Because it is the thing that makes everything else harder to explain, not easier. Brian Hooker is a former United States Marine. That detail gets offered as a defense, as a reason to believe his account, as evidence that he is not the kind of man who panics, not the kind of man who loses his bearings in a crisis, not the kind of man who would stand helpless while his wife went under. Marines are trained to respond. They are trained to assess a situation under pressure and act. They are trained to make decisions in chaotic and dangerous environments when civilians freeze. If anyone on that water that night had the physical capability, the mental discipline, and the practical knowledge to reach his wife and bring her back to the surface, it was a former Marine who had spent 10 years living on that exact boat in those exact waters. That is the argument. And it is a reasonable one on its face. But here is what that argument cannot survive when you line it up against the facts of what actually happened on the water on the night of April 4th, 2026. Because if a former Marine with 10 years of seamanship experience, anchored just 150 yards from shore, in waters he knew intimately, with 2 life jackets in the dinghy and an anchor at his feet, could not save his wife from drowning in those conditions, then what the evidence shows about those conditions, and that timeline has to be examined very carefully. And when you do examine it carefully against the photographic record and the surveillance footage and the witness accounts and the statements given to law enforcement, something does not hold together. That is what this video is about. Not accusations, not conclusions, evidence, witnesses, a timeline that does not align, and the questions that timeline leaves behind. Lynette Hooker was 55 years old. She came from Onstead, Michigan, a small and quiet community sitting roughly 70 miles southwest of Detroit. She was not someone who came to the ocean late in life and learned to love it slowly. The water had been part of her from the beginning. Her mother, Darlene Hamlet, 76 years old, told the Associated Press that Lynette had been sailing and swimming since she was a young girl. It was not a hobby she picked up after retirement. It was woven into her from childhood, from the first time she felt what it meant to be held by moving water and know how to hold yourself inside it. Her daughter, Carly Ellsworth, spoke to CBS News in the days after Lynette disappeared. She did not speculate. She did not reach for comfort in the way that grieving people sometimes do, building an alternative story because the real one is too painful to accept. She described her mother with the precision of someone who needs the listener to understand exactly who they are talking about before they form any opinion about what happened. Lynette was remarkably fit. Lynette was physically strong. Lynette was an excellent swimmer. And then Carly said the sentence that has stayed with every person who has followed this case from the beginning. She said, "There is no way she just fell off that boat." That is not a daughter in denial. That is a daughter drawing a line between who her mother was on the water and what she is being asked to accept as an explanation for her disappearance. For 10 full years, Brian and Lynette Hooker documented their life at sea on a social media account they called the Sailing Hookers. The name was chosen with a lightness that matched the life they had built. The content was real and continuous and specific. Photographs of sea turtles drifting silently beneath the hull of their boat. Photographs of sunsets bleeding orange and red and deep purple across the horizon of open water. Photographs of cinnamon rolls baking in the small galley kitchen of their 55-foot sailboat, a vessel they had named Soulmate. The smell of something warm and domestic rising from below deck while the ocean moved all around them. These were not occasional posts from people who took a sailing vacation every few years and wanted to document it. This was a decade of continuous, deliberate, chosen life on the sea, a permanent address, a decision made once and then lived out every single day across 10 years of water. They had not arrived at this life casually. They had sold the house in Michigan. They had liquidated their assets. They had walked away from everything that most people spend their working lives building and protecting. They had chosen the ocean over all of it. That choice was not impulsive. It was the defining act of who they had decided to become together. Lynette Hooker posted on Instagram on April 4th, 2026. The same day she disappeared. The caption was 4 words. Not going anywhere for a while. She had no idea what was already moving toward her. She had no idea that within hours of writing those words, in the water she had loved since childhood, she would be gone. Now we go back to the Abaco Inn on Elbow Cay on the evening of April 4th. Because what happened in the hours before Lynette disappeared, what was recorded and photographed and witnessed by people who had no stake in any of it, builds a timeline that contradicts Brian Hooker's account in ways that cannot be attributed to memory or grief or the fog of a traumatic night. The Abaco Inn was busy that Saturday evening. Brian and Lynette arrived and settled near the pool. Nothing about their presence there appeared to attract any particular attention. They were a couple at a bar on a Saturday night in the Bahamas. There was nothing to notice. A man named Joe was at the inn that evening. He was a fisherman. He had been snapping photographs of the scenery to share with his mother. The way the light moved over the water, the texture of the Bahamian coastline at the end of a day. He had no connection whatsoever to Brian and Lynette Hooker. He was not watching them. He was not tracking their movements. He was capturing a sunset. But in one frame, almost as an afterthought, captured without intention in the background of a photograph taken of something else entirely, he got them. The photograph is time-stamped at 6:34 in the evening. In the background, near the pool area of the Abaco Inn, Lynette Hooker is visible. She is wearing a light green bathing suit cover-up, bright, clearly layered over whatever she was wearing underneath. The kind of garment that stands out precisely because of its color, because green against the background of a pool and a dock, and the ocean beyond reads at a distance, reads in low light, reads even in water. 4 minutes later, at 6:38 in the evening, the security cameras at the Abaco Inn captured something else. Brian and Lynette Hooker were recorded walking together in the direction of the dock, moving toward the dinghy, moving away from the lights of the inn and toward the open water where their sailboat, the Soulmate, was anchored at a distance. Moving into the evening together, one behind the other, toward whatever came next. That surveillance footage is the last confirmed visual record of Lynette Hooker. Brian Hooker told Bahamian police that they left the Abaco Inn at approximately 7:30 in the evening. Hold those 3 data points together because they are the foundation of everything that follows. 6:34, a stranger's photograph places Lynette at the pool wearing a green cover-up. 6:38, the security camera at the Abaco Inn places both of them walking toward the dock. 7:30, the departure time that Brian Hooker reported to law enforcement. That is a gap of 52 full minutes between what 2 independent recording systems captured and what Brian told police. Not 5 minutes of rounding, not a hazy estimate from someone who was not paying attention to the clock. 52 minutes, and that gap does not sit on the edge of this case. It sits at the center of it, because everything about Brian's account of what happened on the water that night depends on when they were actually on the water. Now, here is where the former Marine's background becomes relevant in a direction that nobody defending Brian Hooker wants to examine too closely. A volunteer named Jim Todd serves with the Hopetown Fire and Rescue Service on Elbow Cay. He has lived on that island long enough that his reputation is known to everyone, and on a small island that matters. He was among the first people to meet Brian Hooker when Brian came ashore at Marsh Harbor in the early hours of April 5th. Jim helped pull Brian from the water's edge, and then he went back out on the rescue boat alongside Brian and members of the Bahamian police to search the waters for Lynette and to have Brian show them where she had last been seen. Jim was also at dinner with his family on the evening of April 4th. He arrived at the restaurant just before 7:30 in the evening, and he paid attention to the conditions outside because conditions on those islands matter to people who live and work on the water. He told investigative journalist Ashley Banfield exactly what he observed. By around 7:30 to 7:45 in the evening, the wind had picked up to the point where being outside was genuinely unpleasant. Darkness was descending. The conditions had turned rough enough that Jim would not have expected to see boats moving out there. It was not a night for casual water travel, and the people who know those waters would have known that. But here is the problem with that observation when you line it up against the surveillance footage. At 6:38 in the evening, the time when the cameras at the Abaco Inn show Brian and Lynette walking toward the dock, the conditions Jim Todd described had not yet arrived. Jim was categorical about this. In those waters in April, at 6:38 in the evening, it was not dark. It was not approaching darkness in any meaningful sense. It was clear, full, unambiguous daylight. The sun would not set for another 45 minutes to a full hour. Anyone on the water at 6:38 on April 4th, 2026 in the Sea of Abaco was on the water in broad daylight. The dinghy ride from the Abaco Inn to where the Soulmate was anchored takes approximately 15 minutes under normal conditions. If the couple left the dock at 6:38, they would have reached the Soulmate at somewhere around 6:50 to 6:55 in the evening. Broad daylight. Brian Hooker described the conditions at the moment Lynette went overboard in specific and vivid terms. He described high winds. He described 3-foot swells. He described winds reaching 22 knots. And he described a darkness so complete, so immediate, so total, that the moment Lynette entered the water, he lost sight of her entirely. She was there 1 second, and then the darkness swallowed her, and he could not locate her despite being in close proximity to where she had gone in. The darkness is not a detail in Brian's account. It is the foundation of his explanation. It is the reason that a former Marine, a man with 10 years on that water, a man trained to respond under pressure, could not save his wife. Without the darkness, without those conditions, without that specific set of circumstances, the account requires different answers to different questions. But at 6:50 to 6:55 in the evening of April 4th, 2026, in the Sea of Abaco, those conditions were not present. Captain Bill was anchored in the same area where the Soulmate was moored that evening. He is a licensed professional mariner. He was there. His account has been verified. He described conditions in that specific location, not across the Bahamas, but in that precise anchorage on that precise night, as not severe. The people who were with him on the water agreed with that characterization. It was not a calm evening, but it was not what Brian described. It was not 3-foot swells. It was not winds at 22 knots. It was not an impenetrable darkness that would cause a person in the water nearby to disappear completely from the view of a former Marine standing in a dinghy a short distance away. 3 witnesses now place independent observations against the conditions Brian described. Jim Todd on the timing of the darkness, Captain Bill on the severity of the weather, and a man named Ken on something different altogether, something that operates not on conditions but on simple geography and the basic physics of how boats move through specific water. Ken is 38 years old and has lived his entire life on the islands of the Bahamas. He knows the Sea of Abaco the way you know the streets of the neighborhood you grew up in, not from study, not from maps, but from decades of watching, living, working alongside that specific body of water. He works as a bartender at the Abaco Inn on Elbow Cay, and on the evening of April 4th, 2026, he served Brian Hooker twice. The first time was around 4:30 in the afternoon. Brian came to the bar and ordered 2 rum and cokes. He paid with a card. He said almost nothing. There was nothing unusual about the interaction. Ken poured the drinks, Brian took them back to the pool where Lynette was sitting, and Ken moved on to the next customer. Standard. Unremarkable. A Saturday afternoon at a busy bar in the Bahamas. Roughly 90 minutes later, Brian returned. The bar was packed by then, moving at the pace that a Saturday night in the Bahamas demands from the people who work it. Ken reached Brian quickly. Brian made eye contact, and he said something that Ken would later repeat publicly, by name in the New York Post and on Fox News, something that would be sworn into the record. Brian Hooker looked at Ken and said, "Thanks for getting me served so quickly." Ken nodded. He poured the drinks. He moved to the next person in line. That exchange, brief and entirely routine, was the last time Ken saw Brian Hooker before the evening ended and the events on the water began. Ken never saw Lynette Hooker at all during the 2.5 hours the couple spent at the Abaco Inn. Both times Brian came to the bar, he came alone. Lynette remained near the pool. Ken served the drinks, processed the payment, heard the brief thanks, and watched Brian carry the glasses back across the room. The next morning, Ken heard what had happened on the water the night before, and what caught him, what would not let him go, was not anything about the man he had served. Brian had been perfectly ordinary at that bar, reserved, polite, controlled in the way that someone with military background often carries themselves, a certain economy of movement and expression that reads as discipline rather than anything alarming. No red flags, nothing that you would go back and re-examine later, looking for a sign you had missed. Just a man who ordered rum and cokes and said thank you for the service. What caught Ken was the math. The distance from the area near Elbow Cay where the incident reportedly occurred to the Marsh Harbor boatyard, where Brian Hooker arrived at approximately 4 in the morning on April 5th, is 4 miles. 4 miles of open water that Brian covered in somewhere between 8 and 10 hours. Ken told Fox News what he thought about those numbers. He used one word, weird, not an accusation, not a statement designed to frame someone. Just the instinctive reaction of a man who has spent his entire adult life watching boats move through those specific channels. And who knows, from that experience, what 4 miles looks like in the Sea of Abaco and how long it takes under various conditions. Ken said that even accounting for a vessel with no engine power drifting on the natural current, even accounting for conditions that were difficult but not catastrophic, covering 4 miles in 8 to 10 hours does not match the way those waters actually function. The currents in those channels, the way the wind moves across the surface in April, the physics of drift in that specific body of water. Ken has watched it hundreds of times. 4 miles in 10 hours simply does not fit. Ken is not a maritime forensic analyst. He holds no official credential that gives his observation the standing of expert testimony. What he has is something that cannot be manufactured in a laboratory or certified on a document. He has a lifetime of watching a specific piece of ocean and knowing how it behaves. And when the numbers someone is telling you about that ocean do not match the ocean you have spent your life on, you Ken noticed. And while Brian was supposedly drifting those 4 miles over those 8 to 10 hours, Lynette was somewhere in that water. He did not call the Coast Guard. Take a moment with that. A man who had just watched his wife go overboard, a former United States Marine with 10 years of seamanship experience in waters he knew better than most, in a dinghy equipped with a radio, did not call the Coast Guard. He did not issue a mayday. He did not contact the Maritime Rescue Services, whose entire purpose is to respond to exactly this kind of emergency in exactly these waters. He did not flag down another vessel. He did not do any of the things that maritime training, common sense, and the desperate urgency of a spouse going overboard would drive a person to do immediately. He drifted for 8 to 10 hours, and he arrived at the boatyard at 4 in the morning, and he came ashore. Jim Todd was there when Brian came ashore, and Jim went back out on the rescue boat with him. And standing on the bow of that boat, Jim asked Brian what Lynette was wearing when she went into the water. This question is not casual in a search and rescue context. It is operational. The clothing description goes into every message, every coordination text, every briefing for every team on the water. Every person scanning the surface is looking for exactly what the description tells them to find. The right description can mean the difference between a recovery and nothing. Brian's answer was consistent across every instance he was asked, from Jim Todd to the search team coordination channels. He said Lynette was wearing a black two-piece bathing suit. A black two-piece. That is what they hunted for in those waters. A woman in a black two-piece bathing suit. The photograph timestamped at 6:34 in the evening, taken 4 minutes before the surveillance camera shows them walking to the dock, shows Lynette wearing a light green bathing suit cover-up, bright, visible, the kind of garment that floats, the kind of garment that holds color against dark water and can be spotted at distance even in diminishing light. The exact kind of garment that a search and rescue team would make their primary visual priority the moment they were told to look for it. Brian never mentioned the green cover-up. Not to Jim Todd on the bow of the rescue boat, not to the search teams running the operation by text and radio, not in any statement that reached the people whose job it was to find Lynette Hooker in those waters. He described a black two-piece. He did not describe the green, not once in any context to anyone involved in the search. Jim Todd told Ashley Banfield exactly what that information did to him when he learned it. He said it profoundly changed how he understood Brian's entire account, because the green cover-up is not a minor detail. It is not something that gets lost in the chaos of a traumatic event. It is the most visible thing on a person in the water. It is the first thing a rescue team needs to know. It is the detail you lead with, the detail you repeat, the detail you make sure every single person searching has locked into their mind before they go out on that water. A man watching his wife go overboard 4 minutes after a photograph captured her in a bright green garment does not describe her in a black two-piece to the people trying to find her. Not if he is actually trying to help them find her. Jim also named 2 other things that he could not move past once alcohol was eliminated as an explanation for Brian's behavior. The first was the anchor. Jim pressed this point directly and without diplomatic softening. If your partner goes overboard from a small vessel, the response is automatic. It is not a trained response. It is not something you have to think about. You drop the anchor. It is right there at your feet. It is heavy and solid, and it serves one purpose in that moment, which is to stop you from drifting away from the person who just entered the water. You drop it immediately. You stop the boat. You call out. You locate them. You get them back on board. Brian Hooker was a former Marine. He had 10 years on that sailboat. He knew where the anchor was. He knew what it was for. He had used it hundreds of times. The anchor was not dropped. The second was the life jackets. There were 2 in that dinghy. Brian has stated he threw a green float toward Lynette when she went overboard, but the second life vest was right there in the boat. It could have been thrown. It could have been used. Or a former Marine, a man trained and capable, could have put one vest on himself, picked up the other, and gone into the water after his wife. The distance to the shoreline was approximately 150 yards. 150 yards. Jim said it plainly and without embellishment. You swim to her. You get to her. You drag her to the beach. You both survive the night. The boat is there in the morning. The boat is the least important thing in that equation. None of that happened. Brian Hooker spoke publicly after his release from custody. He told NBC News clearly and directly that he never hurt Lynette and would never dream of harming her. He said he genuinely wants to find her. He said he loves her. His attorney, Terrell Butler, has stated in the most explicit terms available to him that Brian Hooker categorically and unequivocally denies any and all wrongdoing in connection with the disappearance of his wife. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. The Royal Bahamas Police Force Commissioner confirmed to NBC News that Brian remains a named suspect in the investigation. He has not been cleared. The U.S. Coast Guard criminal investigation is open and active. Every person named in this case is presumed innocent unless formally charged and convicted in a court of law. These facts carry the same evidentiary weight as every other fact in this account. The investigation has not stood still in the weeks since Lynette disappeared. Digital devices seized from the Soulmate are currently undergoing forensic analysis. Investigators are looking at everything the devices recorded, everything they stored, every communication that passed through them, every piece of navigation data that might help reconstruct what happened on that boat and in those waters on the night of April 4th. Separately, investigators are examining data from Lynette's Apple Watch. A United States Coast Guard officer conveyed this to Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, directly by phone. The watch was on Lynette's wrist. It was recording, as it always records, heart rate and movement and position automatically, without anyone deciding to document anything. Whatever it captured during those hours has not yet been made public, but it is being reviewed. The Royal Bahamas Police Force Commissioner has confirmed to NBC News that Brian Hooker is still a named suspect. He has not been cleared. The possibility of rearrest remains on the table. The U.S. Coast Guard criminal investigation remains open. Carly Ellsworth flew to the Bahamas after her mother disappeared. She did not wait for the news to come to her. She went to where Lynette had last been seen, and she walked the shorelines where cadaver dogs were being run in search of her mother. She gave her formal statement to the Bahamian police. And at some point in those days, she found herself standing on the dock looking at the Soulmate, the 55-foot sailboat that had been her mother's home for 10 years. The boat named Soulmate, the boat in every photograph of sea turtles and sunsets and cinnamon rolls from a decade of life on the water. She sat on the dock, and she spoke into the air. She said the words anyway. She said, "Hey, Mom, I am here, wherever you might be." Darlene Hamlet is 76 years old. She is in Florida. She told Ashley Banfield what she wants, and it was the simplest thing in the world. She wants to be able to say, "I love you," and have her daughter come home. There are 6 questions at the center of this case that no account has yet answered to the satisfaction of the investigators still working it. Why does the surveillance camera show Brian and Lynette leaving the dock at 6:38 when Brian told police they left at 7:30? What accounts for those 52 minutes? Why was the green cover-up, clearly visible in a photograph taken 4 minutes before they walked to the dock, never mentioned to the search and rescue teams looking for Lynette in those waters? Why did 4 miles of open water take 8 to 10 hours for a man in a dinghy in conditions that a professional mariner anchored nearby described as not severe? Why was the anchor not dropped at the moment Lynette went overboard? Why was the second life jacket not thrown? And why did a former United States Marine, 150 yards from shore, not enter the water after his wife? Brian Hooker has answers to these questions. His attorney has made clear that those answers exist and that they will be presented in the appropriate forum when the time comes. The investigation will test those answers against the photographic record, the surveillance footage, the forensic analysis of the devices, the data from the Apple Watch, and the accounts of the witnesses who were on the water and on that island on the night of April 4th, 2026. What is not in dispute is the most important thing of all. Lynette Hooker is missing. The investigation is active. The search has not ended. The questions have not gone away, and a 76-year-old woman in Florida is waiting for a phone call that has not come. Anyone with information about the disappearance of Lynette Hooker should contact the Royal Bahamas Police Force or the United States Coast Guard. Both investigations remain open and active. Lynette Hooker chose the ocean as her home. She spent 10 years on it. She photographed its light and its wildlife and its particular way of making the world feel enormous and intimate at the same time. She baked cinnamon rolls on the deck of a boat she loved and posted photographs of sea turtles for people who followed her life from shore. On the last day anyone saw her, she wrote that she was not going anywhere for a while. She was 55 years old, fit and strong, and at home in the water in a way that most people never are. She deserves to have every question in this case followed all the way down to the truth. Every piece of evidence, every witness account, every data point from every device, every minute of that 52-minute gap. Everything followed, carefully and completely, until there is nothing left unanswered. This is not just a story. It is a real life, a real family, a daughter sitting on a dock talking to the empty air, a mother in Florida waiting. The search for truth continues.